And this morning we're pleased to have with us Time magazine columnist Hugh Sidey. For nearly 20 years, Mr. Sidey's special interest has been the presidency, and his column on the subject was the first of its kind. It has run first in Life and in Time for nearly 15 years. He has authored books on Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Ford. Hugh Sidey is a fourth-generation journalist from Greenfield, Iowa. His great-grandfather founded the Adair County Free Press, a weekly paper that is still in the family. Mr. Sidey grew up learning the printing trade, attended Iowa State University, was reporter, business manager, and managing editor of the Iowa State Daily. In 1955, he joined the New York staff of Life, and 2 years later went to Washington. Mr. Sidey covered Dwight Eisenhower's last term. He was with Kennedy at the Vienna Summit and in the motorcade at Dallas. He flew with Lyndon Johnson on all of his Asian missions during the dramatic days of the Vietnam War. He was with Nixon in Peking in 1972 and was one of the first Washington writers to suggest that Nixon's guilt in Watergate would drive him from office. Hugh Sidey journeyed to China with President Ford and was with Ford in Vladivostok, when the second arms limitation agreement was reached with Leonid Brezhnev. Early in Jimmy Carter's presidency, Sidey detected and described in his weekly column the faltering of Carter's administration. Sidey also wrote about the improvement of the president's prospects after the successful Camp David summit and his victories in the final days of the 95th Congress. Mr. Sidey's column this week is entitled, "A Revolution is Underway." He briefly discusses the power of the media in the selection of a president. I will not detail the article, but only mention that the column carries a picture of a distinguished American. Under the photographs are the words, "If elected, would he serve?" The picture is of Walter Cronkite. I am most eager to listen, and I know you are, to our lecturer and his selected topic for today, Power and the Media. I present to you Mr. Hugh Sidey.
Thank you, President Docker. It seems my life is consumed with presidents ever since I've left Iowa, which is pleasant in some respects, and particularly so on this morning. You can't imagine how delighted I am to be back in the prairies, having grown up in them. I've never lost the feel nor gotten it out of my system, and this morning, flying from Kansas City in that small plane to look down and see the winter wheat beginning to ripen, and the Kansas River full, and the Missouri River, which was near my home, was a great sensation. I must say that I have been privileged over these last years to have been able to roam around this world a good deal and watch so-called great men and women participate in so-called great events, but that I get more gratification when I come back here than through almost any of those other experiences. I've watched the process of government and power all around the globe. I sometimes think that if this system is going to survive, it's going to be up to you people who live in the Midwest. It may be the lone repository of common sense left. So you see, you have great responsibilities. Well, indeed, incredible times. We are in a changing world, more so today than any time I remember in the 23 years that I have been covering the world's events from Washington. I've watched it change before in many ways. I was with John Kennedy in Dallas when he was killed, and I can remember standing on the lawn of Parkland Hospital and wondering if this system would ever recover. And I can remember a few hours later standing on the lawn of the White House and looking out through those iron gates at the thousands of people who'd come to mourn Kennedy. And I know all of them, and I know you too, and myself wondered what was in store for us. We survived that, but the system did change. Politics was pushed back a generation. A man who had been defeated became president, and from his presidency, another man who also had been rejected once became president. Our system in many ways is just now recovering from that. I stood on that same lawn at the White House the day after the death of Martin Luther King, and I watched while people looted and burned Washington 2 blocks away from the White House. And I remember when the White House guards put automatic weapons underneath the bushes, a friend of mine turned and said, "What have we come to in this nation?" Well, we got through that also. But then there was the death of Robert Kennedy. There was the recession that came later, the Vietnam War and all of the anguish when Washington was filled with protest and those who marched for peace. There was Watergate and that sequence of sad, squalid crimes against the Constitution, against the government, against the people. Probably more than any other major civilization, this nation has been through more shocks in these last 20 years. And yet the system has come back. It's proved its resilience. It's strong, healthy in so many ways. But you know, I think in many ways we face greater challenges today than in these last 20 years. As a journalist, I could write about these things, the assassinations and the wars and the recessions. That's the standard fare of journalism. And I knew the players, and there were heroes and villains, and there were statistics that we could follow. But the problems that began to accumulate roughly 3 or 4 years ago were brand new to us all. We people in the media business simply had not had to cope before with these shifting currents of emotion all around the world, with the rising aspirations in the third world. We as a society have never before lived on a globe in which another power as great or greater than us and deeply hostile to us has existed. That's a brand new experience. We have never before lived in a time in which we have had inflation at 20% or interest rates at 20%, at least for an extended period of time. We sail on new water there. We don't know the effects of any of these things, not only on our economic system, but on what happens to people, individuals, what happens to families who cannot buy homes, what happens to neighborhoods that cannot improve, what happens to states, and finally what happens to this country. No, out of this accumulated change over the last few years has come a brand new world. I am one part of it. I am in the media. It is an important part of it. And so this morning I would like to talk to you a little about my feelings about that special world. It is disconcerting to those of us who believed we were in a holy world war for clarity and truth to have it suggested that we journalists may be part of the problem. But it is being suggested, and with increased emphasis, not only by the public, which must consume our product, but by an extraordinary number of thoughtful men and women who study what we do. Nor is that all. Many of the leaders in our craft, now known as the media, have raised their own questions, not so much about our goals, but about our techniques and the size and the momentum of this relatively new world of encompassing communication. The most recent voice is one that is very special to me. James David Barber, head of Duke University's Department of Political Science, will have a new book out next month in which he declares without qualification that the new power brokers in presidential politics in America are the journalists. The media create and destroy the contenders for our most powerful office, Dr. Barber contends. I hold great store in what Dr. Barber says. In 1969, before Richard Nixon had assumed power, Dr. Barber predicted that because of Nixon's character, his administration was headed for trouble. Dr. Barber's book, The Presidential Character, published in 1972, offered the most telling measure of presidents in this era that I have read. So when Dr. Barber talks, I listen. But others have had their say recently, too. Columnist Joseph Kraft, one of our very own, just a few days ago, lamenting our personalization of the presidency, singled out what has now become the dominant member by far of our fraternity, television. If you detect a slight prejudice on my part for the print and against television, you are correct. And I live a little, at least in their world, also. But Kraft declared that television focused on personal traits and not necessarily those that assured a good leader. But that television turned a blind eye towards institutions and ideas. His feeling was that that left a great void in the discussion of leadership in this campaign. Here are some others in this rising chorus of concern about media. Richard W. Jenks, former vice president of CBS, declares, "For us, news is bad news, something going wrong, or at least that is the accepted canon of most U.S. journalists." The Washington Post's Myra McPherson found in her coverage of the faltering campaign of Senator Edward M. Kennedy that many of the young reporters who were on that erratic journey reflected the dour belief that there are no heroes. In McPherson's view, these reporters reflected the kind of limping, grinning despair so often portrayed on Saturday Night Live under the guise of humor. Television now dominates politics, writes columnist Richard Reeves. The Tuesday night primaries are, for most Americans, the nominating process. What television chooses to report is the reality of what happened. In most political cases, I would argue, that's Reeves speaking, if television isn't there, it didn't happen. That's a stunning thought. He's a writer, and an astute one. And he says, in most political cases, I would argue, if television isn't there, it didn't happen. Ted Kennedy himself has more or less confirmed this in a way. Talking on the press bus a while back to a reporter, he worried about all the political spectacle that had been created and his part in it. In people's houses, Kennedy said, I find myself talking to the cameras rather than to the people in the homes. It sort of interferes with what we're trying to achieve. That's Kennedy talking. Dr. Ernest Lefevre, president of Washington's Ethics and Public Policy Center, has raised the point about the diminishing distinction between newsmaker and newsman. Advocacy or personal journalism has made celebrities out of those who used to concern themselves only with gathering news. Former Undersecretary of State George Ball noted that prior to 1952, candidates for the presidency felt compelled to expose their views in half-hour speeches. But television has now demanded that their insights on complex issues be condensed into 90-second spots, or at the most, 3-minute spots. To all of these, let me add my questions, which have grown large now as I have moved through the modern media spectacle. Though I am not terribly ancient in years, I have been in various parts of journalism for a long time. I was born in it. I can recall among my first memories wandering through the weekly newspaper shop of my family and watching with wonder the linotypes do their marvelous work, standing transfixed as the old flatbed press began to heave and groan. All too quickly I was involved with those machines and wasn't that fond of them later, but at that time they were a marvelous experience. We never had any lofty ideas that we were professionals. We were in a trade or a craft, important indeed, a part of the public business, but we were gatherers and assemblers of the weekly story in our small part of the prairies. At no time were we to be a part of the news. My heroes of those days were William Allen White of Emporia and Ed Howe of Atchison. They were the journalistic stars of my father, and before him, his father. And the papers of both came to our shop long after both men had died. And it was while poring over these exchange papers that I had my first taste of Kansas. For the first few of my 5 decades in the trade, the old rules were pretty good. Bylines were coveted as a reward for good work. But use of I, the personal pronoun in a piece, was something very special and something not to be repeated too often. The idea that a reporter would actually get mixed up in the events of a story or help create or destroy a political contender was not only out of sight, it was out of mind. In my Washington years, I began to see change take over that fine old world. As a matter of fact, as I look back, it was not that fine and not that good. Certainly it was comfortable, but too much went unnoticed and too much went unwritten. Change came with a rush, and rightly so. Television was the principal new source of energy. When I was covering the White House for Time magazine back under John Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower, there used to be about 25 so-called White House regular reporters. And these reporters attended the twice-a-day news briefings, other times prowled the back offices for special stories or traveled with the president. In the last 20 years, that number has risen to 50 or 100 reporters who more or less keep permanent watch on the White House. The front lawn has become an outdoor television studio, and each day the video journalists struggle to gain time on the evening newscasts. What had been a fairly calm ritual of weighing the day's doings became a dramatic contest. The television reporter who could uncover the most important or bizarre or unusual stories was soon noticed and led his colleagues not only in professional esteem, but in airtime and pay. I remember how shocked Lyndon Johnson was the day he discovered that an NBC reporter was actually paid $60,000 a year. LBJ knew a little about our business, and the idea that a reporter, one of his friendly enemies, shall we say, could command that kind of salary upset him. In my view, it was entirely justified, of course, although not generally spread around the business. But it did signal a change in the media business. It was the first hint of the merger then underway between show business and modern journalism. Stars were needed. Personalities were cultivated, not only to bring the news in the most agreeable manner, but to add luster. The rumor that swept the White House press room the day that Tom Brokaw, now of the Today Show, arrived to be a White House reporter was shattering. It was said he was to be paid $125,000 a year for being a White House reporter. By today's standards, of course, those figures are peanuts. ABC's Barbara Walters went on to become the first $1 million reporter, and Dan Rather's new $8 million contract for the next 5 years to anchor CBS News sets a new record for sheer wealth and a new record for media stardom. The concern is not about the dollars themselves, for surely Dan Rather is worth as much as some corporate executives, and surely his service is as valuable as that of some real estate developers. The concern is that such wealth turns a vital public function toward entertainment. With millions riding on these stars and their programs, the audiences must be lured and sustained. Sometimes in this process, hype replaces substance. Sometimes emphasis is directed more at the Nielsen ratings than national understanding. I should pause here to say that the United States people are the best informed in the world. For all of its imperfections and the mounting concerns which we now acknowledge, the fact is that a diligent listener and reader in this nation can emerge closer to the truth than ever before. We argue here about excellence. There always is more anguish and difficulty in new advances than in the previous effort on which all else is based. It's that old analogy of the high jumper. The last inches are the toughest. The media cherishes freedom, justice, and liberty, just as everybody else. How best to serve that cause is a more profound question as we polish the product. It is critical now, since instant, overwhelming communication all around the globe is fundamental in our struggle to preserve and advance our civilization. One of the biggest growth industries of the last 20 years is the media. I dare say it is reflected here on your campus, in your Department of Mass Communication, or whatever it may be called. There is no Kansas wheat farmer who can or should plan his spring crops without knowing how the president thinks. There is no stockbroker who can go to work in San Francisco ignorant of a presidential speech of the night before. If he is that careless, he is apt to be wiped out by afternoon. I can recall one day listening to Lyndon Johnson express his amazement at the impact of his words. Why, he said, if I get up in the morning and have a cold and my color is bad, all I have to do is to be seen that way on television and the stock market drops 10 points. That's very true. And I can remember John Kennedy one time when I asked him what surprised him most about being president. He said that I, speaking for himself, can get used to the idea of sending troops into battle. But he said, you know, the thing that most baffled him was that one word or one thought had such a ripple effect in the country. It influenced lives. It changed directions of whole segments of the society. And to live with that responsibility was something brand new to President Kennedy. And then he reminded me that a couple of weeks earlier, somewhat in jest, to get people's minds off many of the world's problems at that time, he had suggested that Americans ought to take 50-mile hikes like Marines to get into shape. We had 500,000 people with heart seizures, wrenched backs, leg cramps, ankle sprains. The AMA actually called the White House and told Kennedy, America is not ready for a 50-mile hike. So within the past few years, we journalists have suddenly found ourselves on a gigantic revolving stage. Everybody needs information. They need help in understanding the complex issues besides the facts. Then, too, they want the process to be pleasant. That is not unnatural. But the various parts of that equation may not always be compatible. Here, I believe, is where we create some trouble for ourselves. In searching for that formula of quick, colorful, meaningful news, we stumble over ourselves in the competitive surge, and sometimes we grasp superficialities. I am still pondering whether Richard Nixon lost the first debate with John Kennedy in 1960 because he had sweat on his upper lip and looked nervous. I am not at all chagrined at the outcome of that election. But if, as some analysts truly believe, the first debate tipped the process in Kennedy's favor, we must wonder if that is any way to go about selecting a president. Take some more recent examples. Should that ridiculous debate over the debate in New Hampshire a few days ago among Republican contenders have injured the presidential prospects of George Bush as much as some suggested it did? Bush, as you may recall, sat impassively and even a little flustered at the unseemly spectacle, his Ivy League blood undoubtedly riled at such raucous behavior. Ronald Reagan, an old Hollywood trooper, was plainly more at home in such unscripted dramatics. And he grabbed the mic and asked everybody else in on the match. There are those who believe now that in those few seconds, George Bush's political fate was sealed. That wasn't the whole thing, no. Doubts had begun to creep in about whether George Bush had the right stuff in him. But at that moment, many of those doubts, apparently in New Hampshire, began to congeal into the conviction that Mr. Bush was too timid or too hesitant. Remember Gerald Ford. Out of it now. But remember when he was president and running for re-election. Gerald Ford fell down the ramp in Salzburg. He repeatedly bumped his head on the helicopter door as he tried to get out of it. He swam into the side of the White House swimming pool. He liberated Poland in his debate with Jimmy Carter. And down in El Paso, Gerald Ford ate an entire tamale with the husk still around it. Medical science has not yet figured that one out. But the accumulation of those images may have sunk his second-term ambitions. I would judge today, based on the polls, that a majority of Americans are sorry. If I read the data right, if an election were held today, Gerald Ford would be elected. Gerald Ford, the perceived klutz, loomed larger in American imagery than Gerald Ford, who had a gut feeling about the dangers of inflation, and he vetoed 70 bills to prove it, and a gut feeling about Soviet armament, and he began to rearm. Let me go beyond politics now to what I consider more important than this act of electing. Let's go to the act of governing. Indeed, I judge the current preoccupation by myself and others with this interminable, inane, expensive political comedy that we have had so far to be one of the gross distortions nurtured by the media. It is so much easier and so much more fun to cover politics, and of course so much more entertaining for our audiences, but we overdo it. There is almost an unwitting conspiracy between candidates and journalists. Candidates like to get away and talk where they don't have any responsibility. And in Boise, in Denver, and wherever they go, they can say things that they know they will never have to back up with votes. Journalists like the freedom also. Political reporting is the most inexact science in the whole business. Predictions, well, frequently go wrong, but they aren't held to that. Journalists like the freedom also. Political reporting is the most inexact science in the whole business. Predictions, well, frequently go wrong, but they aren't held to that. You create one scenario today, and by tomorrow you tear it up and you write another one. There's great license in political reporting, as there is in political oratory. And so the candidates and the journalists, like it. Meantime, politicians pander to us as these campaigns go on, as Dr. Barber points out. And politicians, in my opinion, end up being skilled at nothing much but running for re-election. We are in the age, as many have said, of the permanent campaign. And from election to election, men and women simply run for office. I was disturbed to watch Barbara Walters and Walter Cronkite conducting Middle East negotiations on the night the news came that Anwar Sadat had made his dramatic offer to go to Israel in quest of peace. I cannot argue with the outcome of that event, but I watched with dismay as the television impresarios fought for exclusive interviews and sought to push the developments further in each interview. The U.S. State Department looked on helplessly and never did catch up. They were on the sidelines. That episode was a positive diplomatic development. The next one may not be. Any such drama played over the air like that is essentially uncontrollable. Events ride men, and therein lies the danger. In Washington, a continuing debate revolves around the degree to which the media aggravates protest marches, sit-ins, and other forms of violence. There is a considerable body of informed opinion that contends if the cameras and hordes of reporters had not been in Tehran when the American hostages were seized and had not stayed there, that crisis might now have been resolved, or at least less severe. There is a rule in physics that some of you may know that states the very process of measuring certain phenomena affects the results. That is now apparent in the media, and we have not compensated for that in our work. I was disturbed in the past by the Pentagon Papers, to bring it back to the print. The use of stolen government property by the New York Times and the Washington Post in the name of a higher morality parallels to a disturbing degree lawless acts of others whom we condemn. We demand public scrutiny of all high officials and measure them by a rigorous standard of rectitude. Yet the media, as noted in the Pentagon Papers case, sometimes violates those very basic tenets of human behavior and honor that we demand of others. For years, the media have lamented the lapse in the war on organized crime in this country. Story after story pointed out how the FBI in the last days of J. Edgar Hoover had become bogged down in protecting its own empire, in gathering petty gossip and seeking imagined enemies of Mr. Hoover and the United States. Yet, when a new drive on major crime was discreetly launched by the FBI and reached a delicate state in its development, the story was leaked by the Justice Department and eagerly seized and printed by major newspapers. And then, editorial writers who had hailed the recent sting operations by police, which caught petty thieves trying to fence television sets and jewels, suddenly choked up over the idea of catching members of Congress and business executives in larger nets. Journalists who had worried about infringements on their rights, who have lamented premature accusations by others and fought for confidentiality of information taken to grand juries, seemed eager to rush into print with the abscan details before proper procedures to assure justice had been confirmed. As one of my colleagues, George Will, said, we were not quite sure that we had a crisis in the FBI or Justice Department, but we were sure after the first stories that we had a crisis in journalism. Detailing the problems that we in the media now find ourselves confronting is much easier than providing the answers. The world in which we dwell does not wait an instant. It moves with blinding speed. It shrinks with each day. It grows more perilous as each new weapon is manufactured. I do not have any tidy solutions for these problems, nor any handbook for its practitioners. I do have a thought or two. We cannot legislate against media abuses and mistakes. That is far more dangerous than the problems which arise from our stumbles. Like most of my colleagues, I am alarmed by some of the actions of the courts recently designed to restrict access to proceedings, public proceedings, and to give access to some of the confidential information which we gather. That federal judge who some years ago suggested that there must be some rules created to once and for all resolve the conflicts between courts and journalists was hopelessly out of touch, not to suggest even ignorant of our system. The conflicts will always be, they should always be. But since the media has grown to be so powerful and plays such a large part in the exercise of public power, then I would say we in the business must begin to apply the same standards for behavior and judgment to ourselves that we demand in the public's business. That is essentially a personal matter. It means having accepted standards of truth and honesty. It also means, in most instances, employing fairness, decency, understanding, even sympathy and kindness. Too often in these times, we in the media have behaved as if we were theologians. Having established a religion, we were the high priests, possessors of all wisdom, knowledge of objectivity, understanding of what was moral and what was not, judges of character, and the authors of some kind of holy writ for other societies and their leaders. Indeed, from our lofty perch, we sometimes seem to suggest that we were not American, but some special breed, granted extraterrestrial intelligence, and we could look down and render our judgments impartially on all below. The time has come, I believe, when we of the media must realize that we are shaped like other people by our backgrounds, environments, and education, that objective judgments, while nice in theory, rarely exist in actuality. I would go so far as to suggest that the media these days should look with more understanding on the United States and its economic system and its government. That system produced the First Amendment and all the other elements in this extraordinary creature that we call the media. That system is imperfect, even as the humans run it are imperfect, even as the media is imperfect. But that system is in crisis. It needs to be judged, surely. But that judgment, more than ever, needs to be rooted in the understanding that not every human error is a conspiracy, that not every imperfection is cause for loathing, that without some hope and some trust, no system can survive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sidey. I would like to introduce to you the persons who are with us on the platform. On your left, Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, who is chairman of the Landon Lecture series. Mr. Bob Wilson, chairman of the Landon Patrons. And I might point out to you that Mr. Wilson is and has been chairman of the Patrons from the inception of this 50-speaker series. We owe you, Bob, and the Patrons a tremendous debt of gratitude here at Kansas State University. The president of our student body, Mr. Randy Tosh. The president of our faculty senate, Dr. Pete Cooper. There will be time for a few questions. We're approaching the class break time, so if those who have an 11:30 class would like to excuse themselves, we'll hold for just a moment, and then we'll proceed with the questions for a few minutes. You might be formulating your question. I am sure that Mr. Sidey will be as direct and vivid in his response to questions as in his presentation. There are microphones to the right and to the left on the main floor, and we invite the questions.
Do that if you want, yeah. Come right ahead. Ask not necessarily about the media, politics, whatever you wish. Yes.
I am concerned with the media. You've indicated in closing your speech that not every imperfection in the media, or not every imperfection in how the news is reported, should be viewed as a conspiracy. However, I have heard many people, well, I'll say 5 or so, say that the news is controlled, and it seems to me that certainly there's more opportunity for control of the news with respect to TV than with all these little local papers. And so I'm curious about your views on whether the news is controlled in any respect.
Well, the news is controlled in many respects. There isn't any question. All public officials try to control it. Certainly special interests try to control it. it's a constant battle. This is one of those things that will never be resolved. We will always have contention between the business community and journalism, between public institutions and journalism, and that's right. That's the way it should be. I think that the news is less controlled in these days than ever before. I think that basically we've established that bridgehead in Washington. We know pretty well what goes on behind scenes. If there is some delay, like in Watergate, it takes a few weeks or months. That's not particularly good, but maybe not even particularly bad, because ultimately I think most of that comes out. The process finally yields abuses, inefficiencies, stupidities, so that even though there are attempts, and many people still in public life believe that it's their duty to control the news, nevertheless I think as we slowly wear them down. I don't worry that much about control of the news. I just don't think we'll get back into a period like Vietnam where we're misled, or Watergate. My concern about the fact that we view human errors as conspiracies goes back basically to the case of the CIA. We came out of the Watergate episode with many newspapers deeply hostile and bitter because they had lost out on that story. When the New York Times uncovered these abuses in the CIA, they attempted, in my judgment, wrongly, to make that into another scandal of the size of Watergate, to recoup their special prestige. And in that kind of pell-mell rush and the uncovering of these obvious errors of judgment and action by the CIA, it seemed to me that they equated that with Watergate. And they made villains out of some of these people, and it wasn't the case, and still isn't the case. And we damaged the Central Intelligence Agency in that time. And just now we're beginning to understand the full extent of that damage, and now we want to go back to where we were. It's not always that easy. So my basic point is that we simply need to be a little more tolerant in our business and a little more understanding that even as we err, so do other people. And that will always be the case, and those errors should be pointed out to the extent that we're able. But when we suggest, as we did in the case of Richard Helms, the director of the CIA, that he was a conspirator and a perjurer and a man who was suggested vaguely a man who had a plot against the state, I think that was nonsense, and that was very destructive. Yes? Any others over here? Yes.
Mr. Sidey, do you feel that the media has dramatically hindered U.S. foreign relations?
Well, I think that the media in some instances, I don't know whether I'd use the word hindered, but has certainly influenced them. And I'm not always sure to the best. And I take the Tehran situation most recently. There was a delicate state of negotiations. I guess that, I'm torn. I'm kind of inconsistent about it. I don't want to inhibit the media. I want them to be there and to be able to probe around. But this strange creature television, which fills your world for 2 or 3 minutes with screaming people in the streets of Tehran, does strange things across the country, as it did in the Vietnam War. When suddenly your life is consumed by that screen, and that's the only thing that night, at least for these hours, then I think it perhaps gives a distorted view. We need somehow to begin to understand that a little better and to deal with it. But I would say that in some instances, in the hostage situation, particularly in recent times, and I guess generally in our attitudes around the world and our feeling about our leadership role, that the media has distorted the picture and has hurt us and inhibited us in some cases. Where do we go? Left?
Sir, I agree with your concern about some of the problems that you've cited in the journalism field, but I feel that maybe one of the things is that there are problems through our whole national fabric, of which the points you raised this morning are just a part. So my question is, from my limited view, isn't this the kind of things that we might expect to logically come from an embrace in humanism, as I think we see it in this country? We see shifting standards. We see emphasis on gaudy things, things of passing value that makes makes living tenuous, I think, in this time.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think there are many currents swirling around us in our national life. We try to cover them. We sometimes overemphasize them. Perhaps we give them too much prominence, and that tends to exaggerate them even a little more. I think that's absolutely true. Our society has many defects. Our very prosperity, our emphasis on material things, our retreat from the world after Vietnam, our disillusion with power, all of those things have contributed to this current atmosphere, and we are the messengers, and people do tend to kill the messenger. My concern is simply that somehow out of this great moiling society of ours that we have assumed a power that I'm not sure we should have, or if we are going to have it, that we understand fully. But I wouldn't disagree with your premise that indeed some of the problem is reflected in the basic kind of outlook and the nature of our society. As a matter of fact, I would go on. I told a group this morning that I would also condemn, but that's a whole other lecture, not condemn really, but question the listenership, those consumers of the product, that people have become too lazy in this business of being informed, that they want to sit in front of their television set for 15 minutes at night and have the whole world presented to them. And when it isn't, when they discover their errors, or when they find out that there are mistakes, that there are all these human flaws that others make in the news, well, then they're disillusioned. And we are undergoing a great credibility problem now in national life. So I find that there must be increased responsibility by those people who consume the media product. We got one over here.
Okay. So the national debate topic for college this year is whether or not we should increase regulation of mass media communications. Recently, this last weekend, at National Junior Division Debate Tournament, we came across a topic that I'd like to ask you to explain for me. It seems that they wanted to make all of the information available to the CIA, all this classified information, available to the media. Now, what do you think the media would do with that information, and what effect do you think it would have on the government as such?
Well, this is another of these fields in which there'll never be any resolution, finally. We are dealing, as you know now, in Washington with the possibility of a new CIA charter. And within that charter are new regulations on how much of the information in the CIA should be kept private and privileged, secret, and how much should be released, and whether or not they should punish those people in the CIA for releasing information. All of this we're debating at this point. There'll never be a final solution to that. I do believe, though, that in some instances in recent months and years we have gone too far in the Freedom of Information Act, that we have made it almost impossible for certain sensitive agencies like the Pentagon and the CIA to preserve secrets, and I think we're seeing now the results of that. It is hazardous. The Congress in recent years passed a bill that made the CIA have to report to some 8 committees. I think somebody figured out there were 220 people that would ultimately know their secret operations before they happened. There is no way to preserve a secret operation under that ridiculous system. So that there must be some curtailment there. There must be some provision that information about secret operations and clandestine information that comes from agents abroad to protect their security, there must be some way to preserve those secrets. We will always argue about it. The government tends to go too far in the way of secrecy. We now probably go too far in demanding openness. The theory that is propounded by many of my colleagues, probably the more liberal group, is that there should be no secrecy at all, that an open society based on the principles of the Constitution should really have no classified material, at least after a given amount of time. I reject that. I just don't think you can work in this world against adversaries who have such really secret societies as the Soviet Union and win those battles. So therefore I think we have to, in diplomacy and defense matters, maintain a certain degree of secrecy and maintain the confidentiality of certain files. Yes?
Thank you. I agree with, I like the way you summated your topic, that you seem like a man who's sees the faults in the press and is willing to realize that they are not always correct, that they can be wrong and usually are a lot of the times. And
well, now wait a minute. I won't go that far.
But anyways, I think my feeling is that ever since Watergate and the press really did something that was they were powerful. They changed. They were able to kick the president out of the office. But don't you think that since then they have taken on the same characteristics as Nixon did, like arrogancy and just being like they're just
like the people that they
unrealistic.
Yeah.
And don't you think that you mentioned that $125,000 was peanuts for Tom Brokaw, and my God, it takes a man 15 years to make that much money in Kansas or longer. And don't you think that when someone makes that much money, you're removing him from the realm of the common person?
Well, yes, all your concerns I share to varying degrees. I don't agree with you totally on it, and you ignore the great good that came out of Watergate and the necessity of that process. But I don't argue with you about the arrogance and the wealth of the press and this kind of assumption of a special role.
Can I just make one more comment?
Sure.
I just was thinking about this. Irks me so much. You look on the evening news at night and you see Catherine Mackin or some, who knows, some figure up there, and they always say, now I'm not that patriotic. I see this country has a lot of faults, but they always say, the United States did this, the president. I've never heard anybody say, our government supports this or our government supports that. They're too damn objective sometimes, I think. Mm-hmm. I mean, they should be objective, but they're reporting like the United States is some different organization.
Well, this is what I suggested earlier, that we look down on this planet as some special being, and the U.S. is just another one of the unfortunate people down below us. And I think that at this point in our national life, we need to kind of change that a little bit. So I kind of fundamentally support some of the things. Let me say one thing stemming from what you have brought up. Watergate was quite a remarkable performance by the free American press. It was amazing. It was superb in my judgment. It is what it's all about. It was a little late in starting, but it was cautious once it got going, but determined and courageous. And it did a good job. I think Mr. Nixon had all of that and more coming to him. But then I believe that what stemmed out of that, and other things contributed also, was a terribly negative attitude in the press. We got into a destructive mood. Here's where the idea developed that every mistake was a conspiracy, that there was a Watergate behind every corner, that if you saw a senator and he goofed up some way, that if you looked far enough you would discover that he was corrupt clear down to the roots. That, I think, was unfortunate. I think it still exists. I think too many young reporters, modeling themselves on Woodward and Bernstein, believed that the only way to journalistic prominence was to destroy people, to find scandals. And therefore, if you decide your life is going to be based on that, then everything you see is a scandal. And that has been unfortunate. I hope it's changing now. I think it is. I see signs that we're swinging back the other way, and I suppose the pendulum may go too far. We may get too namby-pamby and see too many nice things out there, but that's kind of the nature of the business. But your concerns are justified, and I would agree with much of what you say. I hope we correct it. I hope we are.
You've been listening to an address by Hugh Sidey, the Washington contributing editor of Time magazine, who was the 50th speaker in the series of Landon Lectures on public issues at Kansas State University. Sidey spoke on power and the media. The program produced by Extension Radio Television Film at Kansas State University. Engineers Riddell Staub and Lynn Parker. I'm Ralph Titus, and this is the K-State Radio Network.